They started a war over football. Well, sort of. Honduras and El Salvador went to war in 1969. And if you look up why, the short answer is football. Well, football is not the main cause of the war, but a portion of the cause. Football was just the match that lit the fuse on an extremely long, extremely flammable rope. Honduras is big. One of the larger nations in Central America. Forests, hills, wide stretches of countryside, and compared to its neighbors, it was relatively underpopulated. Lots of space. A lot of that space quietly was already spoken for, held by American banana corporations who had spent decades acquiring Honduran land for almost nothing. El Salvador, just to the south, was the opposite problem entirely. El Salvador is tiny. You could fit 4 of them inside Honduras with room to spare. But El Salvador had one of the densest populations in the entire Western Hemisphere, crammed it into that tiny space. And the land, almost all of it owned by a small aristocratic class. Maybe a few dozen families who had passed it down through generations and had no intention of sharing it. If you were a poor Salvadoran farmer and you needed somewhere to grow food, you had exactly one option: go north to Honduras. And they did. Not in a wave. Quietly. A family here, a family there, crossing the border into Honduras, finding an unclaimed patch of forest, clearing it, planting it, building a small house, surviving. By 1969, around 300,000 Salvadorans were living this way in Honduras. Some had been there for 2 or 3 generations. This wasn't exactly legal, and no one was thrilled about it, but it had been working in a messy sort of way for 30 years. In 1963, General Ordóñez seized power in a military coup. Not unusual for the region at the time. And his government was not going well. The economy was struggling. People were unhappy, and when people are unhappy, they start asking questions. The narrative became the Salvadorans are stealing Honduran land, taking Honduran jobs, draining Honduran resources. In 1969, the government passes a land reform law, officially about improving agriculture, which sounds wonderful. In practice, if you are not Honduran, you cannot own or occupy land. Goodbye. Overnight, 300,000 people became illegal. The Honduran military moved into rural areas. Homes were burned. Families were evicted. People were marched to the border. Some were beaten. Some were killed. El Salvador's government erupted. Honduras said, "Mind your business." By June 1969, both governments had stopped talking to each other entirely. Tens of thousands of Salvadoran families were flooding back across the border with nothing, and the tension between the two countries had built up to the point where all it needed was one more thing to push it over the edge. Then, football happened. This is where we were when the World Cup qualifying matches began. It is 1969. Honduras and El Salvador have both been grinding through the qualifying rounds for the 1970 FIFA World Cup in Mexico. And by a coincidence, so perfectly, both teams make it to the same playoff bracket. 3 games. Best of 3 goes to Mexico. The Salvadoran team arrived in Honduras the night before the match and discovered that Honduran fans had a very creative interpretation of home advantage. El Salvador played the next day on 40 minutes of broken sleep and a personal fury that could have powered a mid-sized city. They held on for 89 minutes. Honduras scored in the last 90 seconds. Final score: Honduras 1, El Salvador 0. Back in El Salvador, an 18-year-old named Amelia, when the final whistle blows, she does something that becomes one of the strangest footnotes in the history of sport. She picks up her father's pistol and shoots herself through the chest. The Salvadoran government declares her a national hero. Her story is broadcast nationally. The football team is made to attend a public tribute. The president himself is photographed in solidarity. This is no longer just a game. Now it is Honduras' turn to travel. The Honduran squad arrives in San Salvador. The Salvadoran fans, having paid close attention to what happened in Tegucigalpa, return the favor with enthusiasm. The Hondurans don't sleep either. Before kickoff, when the time comes to raise the Honduran national flag outside the stadium, the flag that goes up is a torn, dirty rag. El Salvador wins 3-0. It is not close. The crowd becomes a riot after the final whistle. Honduran fans are chased through the streets. The Honduran squad escapes in an armored van. When the Honduran government gets the news, the response is fury, and across Honduras, attacks on Salvadoran immigrants become dramatically, measurably worse. Game 3 was played in Mexico City on neutral ground, because by this point nobody trusted either country to host anything without it becoming a full international incident. El Salvador won 3-2 in extra time. They were going to the World Cup. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador severs diplomatic relations with Honduras. 17 days of silence, of ultimatums sent and ignored, of Salvadoran immigrants still being driven from their homes. And then El Salvador does what diplomacy failed to do. It declares war. El Salvador strikes first and strikes fast. Their air force, which, I should mention, consisted largely of refurbished World War II propeller planes, some of them pulled from storage facilities that functioned essentially as museums, hits Honduran fuel depots, military bases, and the main international airport in Tegucigalpa before the Honduran Air Force can scramble a response. It should not have worked. Somehow, for a critical window, it did. On the ground, Salvadoran infantry and light armor pour across the border in 2 columns. They move fast. Within 2 days, Salvadoran forces are well inside Honduran territory and still advancing. The entire Organization of American States, every member, unanimous, not one abstention, has voted for an immediate ceasefire, but El Salvador did not listen. They said no to a ceasefire. Honduras got its air force operational and hit Salvadoran fuel depots and supply lines. El Salvador's ground advance stalled. The momentum ran out. The OAS came back with actual economic sanctions, ones with real consequences El Salvador couldn't afford to ignore. El Salvador ran out of options, and possibly petrol. This time, when OAs approached them for a ceasefire, they had no option but to say yes. On August 2, 1969, El Salvador withdrew its forces. 100 hours after it started, the football war was over. So, what did the football war actually accomplish? Somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 civilians dead. Historians disagree on the exact number because tracking casualties during a chaotic 100-hour conflict across a poorly documented border is, it turns out, difficult. The vast majority were people with no say in any of these decisions. The Central American Common Market, the most promising regional economic framework in decades, carefully built over years, collapsed entirely. Both countries stopped trading with each other. The neighboring countries lost confidence in the whole thing. Years of economic cooperation, gone in 4 days. Ordóñez got his short-term win. The Salvadorans were expelled. He'd redirected national frustration outward, declared victory, wrapped himself in patriotism, and bought himself more time and power. The economy didn't improve. The corruption didn't end. The land was still owned by the exact same people it had always been owned by. El Salvador ended up holding a catastrophe. 300,000 people poured back across the border into a country with no land available, no jobs waiting, and absolutely no plan. Every single problem that emigration had been quietly papering over for decades came home all at once. Poverty deepened, inequality widened, repression increased, organized resistance grew, more repression. The cycle tightened year by year. In 1979, 10 years after the football war, El Salvador fell into a full civil war. It lasted 12 years. 75,000 people died. The football war didn't directly cause the civil war, but it removed the last few things standing between an already unstable country and complete breakdown, and it accelerated every condition that made catastrophe inevitable.